Thank you, Carl. So finally, I'm going to talk about the topic of apprenticeships. Now, apprenticeships are not a new idea. In England, at least, they date back to at least the 12th century. And if you look around this great room, you'll see the guilds of livery companies who ran apprenticeships in the Middle Ages. They've taken many guises over time, and fast forwarding to current day, there is now cross-party support for increasing numbers of apprentices. Under the last Labour government, apprenticeships increased throughout the late 2000s. The coalition government succeeded on a pledge for 2 million new apprenticeship starts between 2010 and 2015. The current UK government has a commitment for 3 million new apprenticeship starts in England between 2015 and 2020, building on a Conservative manifesto commitment. Not only is this a target, this target is now legally binding. So just as with the child poverty target and overseas development assistance, we've chosen to make this legally binding. Now, what legally binding means in this context, I have absolutely no idea. Will the minister be thrown in prison if we don't meet this target? I have no idea. But in all seriousness, this is clearly a high-profile target for the government. And to help meet this target, they've introduced a range of policies and measures, including a new apprenticeship levy, a new funding system in England, and a range of targets for public sector employers. And throughout the rest of this presentation, I'm going to ask, how does this compare with the current system? Is there a good case for this set of reforms? And what are the likely effects going to be on employers and workers? So to go back to some more existential questions, what is an apprenticeship? What is an apprentice? They have a very long history and have taken many guises over time, but in practice, they've always been about a young person learning a skilled trade from more experienced workers or craftsmen. Now, what the government means is slightly different. They mean publicly funded apprenticeships, and to receive public funding, an apprenticeship must meet a quite specific set of criteria. It must be a full-time job, lasting for at least a year. Apprentices can be paid lower minimum wages for a specific period of time. Apprenticeships must have a clear plan for the skills apprentices will learn over the course of their apprenticeship. In other words, there must be a curriculum. And apprentices must spend at least 20% of their time attending off-the-job training, so say attending a course in a college of further education. Who are the sorts of people who do these publicly funded apprentices? And they might be slightly different from the public understanding of what an apprentice is. Well, the vast majority take place in the service sector, retail, business administration, public and social care. The majority aren't in the sort of skilled trades that the public thinks about when it thinks about apprenticeships. But this should probably be no surprise, as we're very much a service sector economy. Around 60% of apprenticeships are at the equivalent of GCSE levels. So these are mostly people who haven't achieved very high levels of qualifications from after leaving school, going on to do apprenticeship at some point later in life. And I say later in life because around 44% of apprentices are over the age of 25. And this might be stretching the definition of what young means, but this is certainly where most of the growth of apprenticeships has been over the last 10 years. To illustrate this, this graph shows the number of apprenticeship starts in England from 2005-06 through to 2015-16. And it breaks it down in terms of whether the apprentice was 16 to 18, 19 to 24, or 25 and older. And as you can see, the numbers have grown over time from a little under 200,000 in the mid-2000s to around 500,000 per year in 2015-16. But most, if not quite a large proportion of this growth, can be accounted for by increasing numbers of apprenticeships taken by over 25s. And if you look specifically at 2010, you see a very big jump in the numbers of apprentices aged 25 or over. And this could actually represent a relabelling rather than a genuine increase in the number of apprentices. In this year, funding for the old government's flagship scheme for training, Train to Gain, was shifted from Train to Gain to apprenticeship programme. So some of this may well be a relabelling in order to help meet a quantitative target. Now, I'm all for better quality of training, but if this is just relabelling, it doesn't seem like a genuine increase in training. But what will the new system look like, and how will it differ from the old system? So From April 2017, employers will have to pay a new apprenticeship levy equal to 0.5% of their pay bill in excess of 3 million. So if you have a pay bill of 3 million, you'll pay zero. If you have a pay bill of 4 million, you'll pay about £5,000. The OBR estimates this will raise around 2.8 billion by 2019-20, and the government says this will affect about 2% of employers. These employers employ a very large number of people. We estimate that they employ at least 60% of employees in the country. Alongside this, and partly funded by it, the government is introducing a new system of apprenticeship funding in England with higher levels of subsidy for off-the-job training costs. Apprenticeship policies is a devolved responsibility, and I won't be going into more detail about the decisions the devolved administrations have made with regard to apprenticeships. On paper, there is actually a link between your levy payments and how much subsidy you'll receive from the government. However, this link in practice is extremely weak. So if you don't pay the levy, you will receive a subsidy equal to 90% of off-the-job training costs up to some given price cap set by the government. If you pay the levy, you will receive a subsidy of either 100% or 90%, depending on how much levy you pay. Now, from my perspective, 90 or 100% is basically close to almost all the costs of off-the-job training costs up to the price cap. And it's these price caps, in fact, that will be far more important for determining the level of subsidy that employers will receive. So how does this compare with what we're doing at the moment? Well, the first thing to say is that we already spend about 1.8 billion on subsidising apprenticeships in England in 2016. Well, we plan to spend in 2016-17, and these subsidies vary by age group. So there's 100% subsidy up to a price cap for 16 to 18-year-olds, 50% for 19 to 23-year-olds, and around 40% for 24 and over. By 2019-20, the total apprenticeship budget is expected to be about £2.5 billion. So that's a rise of about £640 million compared with what we were going to be doing in 2016-17. So far less than what the apprenticeship levy raises. In effect, around 3/4 of the new levy is simply a net tax rise. Or another way of seeing this is the fact that we are raising this apprenticeship levy means that we can redirect what we were already spending on apprenticeships elsewhere. And the subsidy rates of around 90 to 100% imply the biggest rises for apprentices aged 19 plus. And it's this group where we've seen most growth, and given these changes, I expect to see most growth amongst this group yet again. And in terms of the numbers of apprentices that will need to begin in order to meet this target, we currently have around 500,000 apprenticeship starts in England, so to meet the 3 million target, we'll need to have around 600,000 per year on average over the course of this Parliament, so a rise of at least 20% compared with the current level. And what's slightly amazing about this number is that it would probably be completely unsustainable in the long run. It would imply that 90% of people would be doing an apprenticeship over the course of their lifetime, or that people will end up doing multiple apprenticeships. Now, we have a legally binding target that has no long-run sustainability. That seems rather bizarre to me. But moving on from that point, we're clearly expanding the number of apprentices and apprenticeship funding. Is there a good case for this? The case the government makes can be largely boiled down into these 4 points. There is a skills problem amongst UK workers. Employers have a weak incentive to invest in training. There's been a complete collapse in workplace training undertaken by employers, and there are huge returns to public investment in apprenticeships. So let's take these points in turn. So starting with the first 2 points, I'll give 2 big green ticks. The fact that there's a skills problem amongst UK workers is largely well known and has been for the last 20, 30 years, if not longer. There is a relatively low quality of vocational education, and that's seen to contribute to relatively low levels of productivity compared with other countries. There is a vast economic literature talking about the fact that employers have a relatively weak incentive to invest in training. But the government makes a third point, that this problem in some sense has been getting worse. And I'd like to say a little bit more about this. So to justify this point, the government often presents this graph. In particular, it presents it in the budget and its 5-year plan for apprentices. and it shows the number of employees attending training falling from around 180,000 in the mid-1990s to around 20,000 in the latest year of data. That's a fall of around 80%. And 80% is a very big number and a very big fall. But this is a somewhat questionable measure of training. In fact, it measures the number of people in employment whose actual hours worked was less than usual because of training course away from the workplace. Now, I don't really know what that means. In order to be counted in this measure, you need to report that you're working fewer hours than usual, and that you're working fewer hours than usual because you're attending off-the-job training. So there's 2 points here. You have to be working fewer hours than usual and attending off-the-job training. The off-the-job training point is important because it misses any on-the-job training, which is becoming increasingly important in the UK. So we can compare this with other more comprehensive measures of training and education. So this graph here shows the proportion of employees receiving job-related training or education in the past 14 weeks, falling from around 32% in the mid-2000s to around 23% in the most recent year of data. And if we look in the last 4 weeks, the number's lower because it's asking for a shorter window of time. And again, we see a modest fall. So there's been a fall, but no collapse. How does the government series compare with this? This is the government series. If you can see it, it's right next to the x-axis. It represents a fall from around 0.4, 0.5% of employees to around 0.1%. It's this relatively flawed measure of training that the government is using to justify a very large increase in apprentices and apprenticeship funding. Moving on, so I'll give a big X on this point. There has been a shift to on-the-job training, but whether this is a bad thing or a good thing, it's probably more likely to be a reflection of the fact that we're now a more service sector-orientated economy. The fourth point the government makes is that there are huge returns to public investment in apprenticeships. In particular, it says that every £1 public investment will generate economic benefit equal to around £26 to £28. That's a very good investment if you can get it. But as we detail in the chapter in a very long footnote, this is based on wildly optimistic and somewhat flawed assumptions. And I could go into detail, but I think it's quite clear that such numbers don't really pass the smell test. And it's a real shame, actually, because the evidence that does exist on apprenticeships says they do generate relatively good returns, particularly in the industries where they've been relatively widely used on a long-standing basis, and they're higher returns than existing vocational qualifications. There is a good case for expanding apprenticeships. It's not the one the government's making. So, moving on to what the likely effects of this new and expanded system are going to be. We can take it in turn, starting with the effects of the apprenticeship levy. So, the apprenticeship levy will, in effect, be like any other payroll tax, such as employer national insurance contributions, and will likely have very similar effects in that it will reduce the wages of employees and reduce the profits of companies. And the OBR estimates that the apprenticeship levy will reduce average earnings by around 0.3%. So there'll be quite a substantial amount of the apprenticeship levy will be incident on employees. What will be the effect on the quantity of training? Well, the first thing to expect is that we will have more apprentices. We're increasing the subsidy for apprenticeships, therefore there will be more people called apprentices. And I say called because one might expect there to be a significant amount of relabelling by firms in order to benefit from this subsidy. And that's exactly what we saw to some extent with Train to Gain getting migrated over to the apprenticeships programme. There could also be an element of substitution. So firms moving from, say, more on-the-job training, which we've been doing a lot of recently, to shifting to this off-the-job training called apprenticeships in order to benefit from the subsidy. As a result of this sort of substitution and relabelling, we might expect the overall effect on levels of training to be relatively small. And that's exactly what the economic evidence suggests, that employers engage in a lot of relabelling and a lot of substitution in response to such subsidies. The third question is one that's not often asked, but is actually really quite important. What will be the effect on the price of training? Now, in this scheme, the government will be providing subsidies equal to almost all the costs of off-the-job training costs up to these price caps. And it will be employers who decide which training provider to go with and negotiate the price. They have absolutely zero incentive to negotiate a lower price below the price cap. So what will happen is that training providers will price at the price cap, employers will then receive their funding and buy training at the price cap. There will be very little competition and will offer relatively poor value for money for both employers and for the taxpayer for that matter. The fourth question, which will be the most important for determining the overall effect on skills and productivity, what will be the effect on the quality of training that employees receive? Now, the government takes this very seriously, and a lot of the measures it's putting in place seem like relatively sensible measures. So it's created a whole new body called the Institute of Apprenticeships that will be responsible for approving apprenticeship programs. The Skills Funding Agency will decide on what the price caps are going to be for particular apprenticeship programs and will regulate the registers of training providers and assessors. Ofsted will inspect training providers. Ofqual and other bodies will be responsible for the assessment procedure. Given the number of bodies involved, you have to be slightly worried about who's actually ultimately holding the ring on the quality of apprenticeships. And given the headline target of 3 million apprentices, you might be genuinely worried that quantity will trump quality in this regard. And you can see this in two important aspects of the new quality regulation system. So firstly, you might be worried that the Institute of Apprentices will become under significant pressure to approve apprenticeship programs in order to help meet this target. And secondly, with regards to Ofsted. So Ofsted inspections of training providers, I think, would be very, very welcome and would help employers in terms of making their decisions. But the inspections that Ofsted have done to date has revealed a certain degree of heterogeneity in the quality of apprenticeship programs and employer training providers, and whether they'll have the capacity to inspect all these new employer training providers that will be set up in response to this subsidy, I have some slight concerns there. The last area I'd like to talk about is the effects on the public sector, where the effects could be slightly different because of a particular target the government is imposing on public sector bodies in England, which is that any public sector body with more than 250 employees must employ new apprentices equivalent to 2.3% of their current workforce. So if you're a hospital of 1,000 people, every year you have to take on 23 new apprentices. And this is justified as the public sector delivering its fair share of the 3 million target. The basis for this target is highly questionable. Most of the employees in these organisations have very well-established training routes, so nurses, doctors in hospitals and healthcare providers, teachers in schools, and most of them are graduates. Now, it may well be that an apprenticeship would be a good way, or something like an apprenticeship would be a good way of training such employees, but to say it's because of this target we need to change their training route seems a really bizarre way of doing things. Also, the public sector currently makes relatively little use of apprenticeships, and this target would imply a quadrupling in the number of apprenticeships undertaken in the public sector. There is very little rationale for how this would improve the skills or quality in the public sector. It's all about meeting the target. And with that in mind, I'm pretty sure the public sector as a whole would benefit if this target was completely removed. So to conclude, I've at some points had some sort of light-hearted take on some questionable government statistics and assumptions and targets. I'd like to end by making a somewhat more serious point, which is there is actually a really good case for expanding the numbers of apprenticeships in areas where we can assure their quality and we can assure that they're better than vocational qualifications that exist already. Skills and productivity would benefit as a result of those expansions. And it's a real shame the government is completely overstating the case for expanding apprenticeships to a degree that is very worrying. And the combination of 100% subsidy and large headline quantity targets is to some extent a toxic mix and risks repeating, actually, policy mistakes that have been made over decades. In the mid-2000s, we had targets for the number of level 2 qualifications, and we provided 100% subsidy. And as far as we can see, they achieved those quantity targets, but with very little other relevance for skills and productivity. And we worry that the current set of apprenticeship targets and 100% subsidy risks repeating those mistakes again. Thank you very much.